United States of America versus Meyer Lansky. Flamingo, Las Vegas, $36 million skimming case. Meyer Lansky was a Russian-born Jewish immigrant who arrived in America in 1911. Before graduating from high school, he dropped out to start working on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And he became friends with Bugsy Siegel when they were teenagers, and they formed the Bugs and Meyer mob. He also became friends with Lucky Luciano, who would be known as the father of modern organized crime. Lansky said, "I tried to be friendly with people that I had to do business with, also my competitors. 1,000 friends can't protect you from one enemy. The men who mostly made it to the top were men with integrity. Whatever business I decided to be in would never change my principles. Regardless of cost, no money would rule me." In 1931, the Italian, Jewish, and Irish mobs joined forces to form the National Crime Syndicate in order to create more harmony and more revenue. The syndicate was called the Commission, or the Boss of All Bosses. Lucky Luciano was the first chairman, and Meyer Lansky, who was the mob's accountant, was on the board. And he was a key leader in getting the National Crime Syndicate together. Murder Incorporated was the enforcement division that was responsible for over 400 contract murders. The Bugs and Meyer mob was a predecessor to Murder Incorporated. Bugsy was the violent muscle with a hair-trigger temper, while Meyer was the low-profile, easygoing brains of the operation, who usually did not get directly involved in the criminal activities physically or financially, especially later in life. In 1946, Lansky and the Commission funded the completion of the Flamingo in Las Vegas that Billy Wilkerson started building. His second wife, Teddy Schwartz, said, "When I married Meyer, he seemed like a legitimate businessman. No drugs or prostitution from what he told me, two things he loathed. His business was bootlegging and gambling, and I didn't resent that either. I saw no wrong. He owned very classy clubs, and only the most desirable people were there, drinking, dining, gambling, and enjoying."
And Meyer was always fair. He abhorred bust-out joints. That's where they rigged up roulette tables with battery operation, or phony dice, what they call top or bottom, or slice dice. Meyer would have none of it. He insisted on a fair, honest game, and that's how he built his reputation.
A handshake from Meyer Lansky was worth more than the strongest contracts that a battery of lawyers could put together, dotting the I's and crossing the T's with the whereases and the therefores. He was a man whose word was good.
Lansky hated Las Vegas because it was in the middle of a very hot, barren desert, so most of his time was spent in New York and Miami, where his illegal casinos were located. Bugsy Siegel, who ran the Flamingo on behalf of the Commission, was murdered 6 months after the casino opened on June 20th, 1947, but Lansky would own a part of the Flamingo for the next 20 years. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said on July 3rd that the Bureau had no jurisdiction in this matter because there was no federal violation involved. But the FBI would assist local and state authorities with information they received. The Siegel murder has never been solved. The Kefauver Senate Crime Investigation Committee in 1951 stated that one of the two major crime syndicates in the country was the Lansky Syndicate based in New York. By 1957, the FBI would conduct appropriate investigations concerning Lansky's present activities and ascertain whether he is tied up in gambling activities or other activities. Meyer spent about $8 million opening a legal casino in Cuba in December 1957. But about a year later, when Fidel Castro took over Cuba, he also took over all of the casinos. Lansky lost his Havana Rivera casino, and authorities in Florida were getting tough on his illegal Florida casinos, so he had to rely heavily on his Las Vegas casinos to make up for the multi-million-dollar Cuban casino loss. In 1958, the Vegas authorities determined that Lansky does not officially own any casinos or related properties. But he did have hidden ownership in the Desert Inn, Flamingo, Fremont, Sands, Stardust, and Thunderbird in Vegas. In 1960, Lansky was paid $200,000 when he brokered a $10.5 million deal for Morris Landsberg and others to buy the Flamingo, but he was still a part owner. By 1960, the FBI discovered a skimming operation at the Flamingo. According to one of Lansky's former associates, the skimming worked like this. Each night in Las Vegas, some of the cash profits were taken off the top of the hotel's winnings, and a mule would carry the money to Miami by train. Lansky and his associates would meet in the card room of the Singapore Hotel in Miami, distribute it amongst themselves by shares, and the remainder would be sent off to Switzerland. On March 1, 1961, the FBI said that Lansky is one of the prominent hoodlums selected as a prime target for early federal prosecution. Bureau has directed that every resource be used towards this objective. It is believed that unusual investigative techniques are necessary to develop information. A successful prosecution will only be brought about through the development of new information. It is believed that an evasion of income tax is the most valuable area where Lansky can be successfully prosecuted. Periodical full-time physical surveillance will be considered. The special agent in charge of Miami said that the Miami office will press this investigation vigorously on a continuing basis and under my personal attention and direction. The Miami office determined that the use of microphone surveillance at his home is not believed feasible. As the FBI investigation continued, they found a few names that he would go by. In May of 1962, Meyer was recovering from a heart attack in New York when he told his wife that "we're bigger than U.S. Steel," which would become one of the most famous quotes from a mobster. In November 1962, the FBI had connected a skimming operation to Lansky. It was also reported that he is one of 2 Jews who are recognized by the Italian Commission at this time. By 1963, Meyer has more ownership in the casinos in Las Vegas than everyone else put together. He has a piece of virtually every casino due to his early entry as a protection for the Jewish element who organized the gambling industry there. Crime Files revealed Lansky one of the biggest mobsters ever to operate in the United States. With Siegel, he bossed West Coast gambling. With Frank Costello and Frank Erickson, he ran gambling houses in upstate New York, New Jersey, Florida, New Orleans, and Las Vegas. With Buckhalter, he directed operations of Murder Incorporated. And Lansky is the only one of the big 6 Eastern mobsters still around. But despite more than 30 years of organized crime, he only served a few weeks in county jail in 1953 for an illegal gambling operation in Saratoga Springs, New York. Apparently, he pled guilty and went to jail because he didn't want to bring more exposure to the mob. The Las Vegas Sun said that the Nevada State Tax was conducting an extensive hearing into the alleged undisclosed interests held by Meyer and brother Jack Lansky. In 1967, Kirk Kerkorian bought the Flamingo, and this would end the ownership of the Flamingo by the mob. In 1969, the Nixon Justice Department's Organized Crime and Racketeering Section established Strike Force 18 to track Lansky's millions and identify his associates. Soon the Lanskys were under 24-hour surveillance.
It's fun to go out with them. In the early days, it seems like we always had a nice escort supplied by the federal government. Some of the FBI guys assigned to him would always be on their duty tracking him. So we'd go in to eat somewhere, and they'd come in and they'd sit down like they were regular customers, so they kind of stand out with the white shirts and the black ties. And my grandfather would always pick up their check. He said they're just doing their job, and that's all they were doing.
You're portraying him as a very sweet, intelligent, and affectionate man.
He was. He was. You have to remember that we're his family, and whatever his business was his business, and the two roads didn't cross. It was always kept separate to us. So yes, we had the warm side, we had the giving side, we had the prepare his children for the future side.
Your mother was telling me that he never shot anybody.
Not that we know of. There's no heads on the wall that we could say, you know, there's what he bagged. He was the brains. He was the accountant.
In April 1970, the IRS was looking into the correctness of Lansky's income tax returns for 1967 and 1968. On May 19th, Meyer cordially talked to an FBI agent following him and told the agent about his travel plans around the country since he might be arrested soon. He stated he did not have reservations of FBI agents following him since he had never been treated unfairly by one of them. Also in 1970, the Hilton Corporation became the first major hotel chain to own a Las Vegas casino when they bought the Flamingo. This was possible after Nevada passed the 1969 Corporate Gaming Act, which said that shareholders did not have to be licensed as an owner of a casino, which in the past would require that every shareholder go through a background check. David Schwartz said, one popular view of the history of Las Vegas, propounded in book form by David Johnston, is that the state of Nevada invited mafia members into Las Vegas to build the casino industry. Later, with its duplicity matched only by its rapacity, the state swept them out and replaced them with respectable corporate owners once the industry was safely established. And the Justice Department was ready to sweep out a 5'5" leader of the Jewish mafia. But Lansky was difficult to investigate because he kept a low profile. In spite of being one of the richest and most powerful men in the United States, Lansky maintains his modest lifestyle to the last detail. He courts anonymity with a passion worthy of Howard Hughes. When the phone rings, he never answers it personally. He seldom goes out. Lansky's main pleasures are simple. He likes to travel, to go for walks, and to lie in the sun. Sometimes, the FBI would follow him on a daily basis without anything significant to report. On June 5, 1970, a Miami grand jury began a major investigation to determine if mafia-tinged money was skimmed from the Flamingo and secretly funneled to Miami. Morris Landsberg, a former co-owner of the Flamingo, was one of the first witnesses called. Lansky has been the constant factor in a changing cast of characters the government determined was involved in the skimming operations in the early 1960s. In July, Meyer traveled to Israel on a tourist visa and reportedly intends to apply for citizenship under the Israel's unique law of the return, which says no Jew can be denied entry or citizenship. But there are exceptions, and one of them is if the person has a criminal past or current charges. Reader's Digest described him as public enemy number one. Margaret Carroll of the Miami Herald said, although it's been known that the U.S. officials have been checking on profit skimming allegations since last year, the filing of the papers was the first time that Lansky was publicly linked to their probe. And multiple former Flamingo employees have been given immunity so that they will be compelled to testify. In January 1971, the Justice Department set up Strike Force Number 18, and by April, there were 5 attorneys and 4 investigators. They were to determine if Lansky has a criminal organization behind him, its nature, and extent. On March 4, 1971, he was served a subpoena in Israel to appear March 10th in Miami, Florida, before U.S. grand jury proceedings. Lansky commented to the effect that the early date of March 10th was unfair. He did not state whether or not he would honor the subpoena. 5 days later, he did an interview on Israeli TV.
Mr. Lansky, why are the American authorities after you?
Because the newspaper man started a campaign against me, and it snowballed to such an extent that I guess it can't be stopped anymore. I was singled out for some reason. They needed an image. And this has gone to an extent where it just snowballed, and I don't know how far it's going to go.
And when did the snowball start rolling?
Well, actually, it started about 1965, when some newspaper man wrote an article that I have $300 million. Well, I wish I had $1 million. I said, many more things, remember, have been said about me. They accused me of making a president. Now, I don't know Mr. Nixon any more than what I read in the newspapers. And the closest I ever got to him is seeing him on television. They claim I have 50% of Lebanon casinos, 50% of Monte Carlo. Roosevelt sent me to visit Batista on a mission. Now, how ridiculous can we really get? This is just a gullible lie. Say it long enough and you'll get the people to believe it.
So you feel that you're a victim of public persecution?
I sure do.
Mr. Lansky, what does the name Jewish Mafia mean to you?
You know, I never heard that until I read it in the Israeli newspapers. Why, it's most ridiculous.
Are there many Jews in the gambling business?
Well, when you say many, you'd have to judge by percentage. I think if you took the percentage of the gambling business in the United States, took the Jews, you would find them maybe in their proportion.
Why is it said that you are the head of the organized crime in the United States?
Well, that's the same principle that started the other gossip. That's most ridiculous. It's the news media again. It's the follow-up of the first thought. It was never said about me before, years ago. All this came about just in the last few years. I didn't know as I was growing older it's going to get worse.
Is there an organized crime?
Is there? I have no knowledge of it.
Are you a religious Jew?
No, I'm not a religious Jew.
And what
But
are...
I'm a Jew. In my heart.
Mr. Lansky, how do you reconcile the accusations against you in so many publications with your claim of innocence?
How do I reconcile it?
Yep.
Well, it's from the same source. They started the publicity they could never stop. And I was told by a good authority that they'll never stop. They have too big an investment in me now. Now, I have been under surveillance for many years now. Maybe for the last 10 years. And I'm sure if these men didn't find anything against me, who have every resource at its hand, they should know whether I'm in any wrong activities or not. They would know much better than the writers.
Do you want to become an Israeli citizen?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Lansky, did you invest money in business in Israel, or do you intend to invest money?
No, I'm retired. And I would like to stay as a retired man in Israel, just like any other retired Jew.
2 days later, Miami federal court judge Atkins upheld the subpoena, and Lansky failed to appear in Miami. Victor Reisel said, "There is no more agile, artful dodger than Meyer Lansky. He is the first man, to my knowledge, ever to raid a full-fledged Special Justice Department strike force all to himself. There are 17 federal strike forces. They are geographic. The Lansky Strike Force, which is number 18, is subject-oriented. On March 24th, an arrest warrant was issued on criminal contempt charges for failing to appear in court, and he is now a fugitive. The next day, the Miami federal grand jury indicted Lansky, Morris Landsberg, and others on tax evasion and interstate racketeering related to skimming at the Flamingo. On May 18th, he was officially advised by the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv that his passport has been revoked. He was requested to surrender his passport to the consular section. On July 15th, his attorney wanted a hearing in accordance with the passport regulations. About a week later, the FBI learned that he was given an extension of his tourist visa for the 6th time, while Israel determined if he will get citizenship. Meyer raised funds and gave Israel money to buy small arms for their war in the 1940s, which resulted in the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, so he assumed that Israel would give him citizenship. Lansky's American passport was revoked in August, so that at this time, the United States will only permit him to return to America. On October 22nd in Las Vegas, a grand jury indicted Meyer Lansky and 3 other persons on a charge of conspiring to illegally conceal and distribute about $36 million in unreported income from the Flamingo Hotel from 1960 through 1967. The Las Vegas charges were a superseding indictment so that the case could be moved from Miami to Las Vegas. There are 5 counts, and each count has a 3 to 5 year maximum sentence. Gabriel Bach was a state attorney for Israel, and he went to Washington, D.C. in 1972 to talk with U.S. Attorney General John Mitchell to investigate whether Lansky should get Israeli citizenship.
That was 2 weeks before Watergate started. And I came to him and I told him that, and he said, "Oh, I'm so delighted that you've come. We were so worried that you there in Israel, because this man has got millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, that because of that you don't care what sort of a person he is, whether he becomes a citizen, not becomes a citizen, just because of that, and that Israel is not interested." And therefore, we really were worried. We didn't apply to your ambassador or to your government because we didn't want to raise the suspicion that we Americans interfere in your internal decisions on questions of policy, whether you accept this person or that person. And therefore, we hesitated and we didn't want to apply. We didn't talk to the ambassador. We didn't ask your government and so on. But now that you have arrived, this is really wonderful. And while we were talking, he was talking to Nixon all the time. I mean, that was another thing. I mean, all the other things that were developing, that was for me rather interesting. And then, yes, well, I keep tactful about that. So anyway, he then said, "All right, I'm going to give instructions that all the files."
The Justice Department gave Israel the complete Lansky files.
They had first-hand testimony from witnesses who had seen Lansky beat up somebody or participate in beating up people. So they had a lot of stuff from the 20s and 30s which had Lansky actually doing a bunch of things as opposed to just kind of walking his dog, which is what he was doing in the 1970s.
And they gave me, for instance, illegally obtained conversations which were recorded illegally by the Secret Service in America amongst gangsters. And then one of them said, "The only Jew that we respect is Meyer Lansky, although what remains for us is only what he leaves after what he steals from the gambling table," and so on and so forth. And then I came back to Israel, and I spoke to the Minister of Interior, and I persuaded him not to grant Lansky the nationality of Israel. And then Lansky applied to the Supreme Court, sitting as High Court of Justice, against the government. And I represented the government in that case. I was criticized then by many people in Israel. They said, "This man is over 70. You now try to prove what the American police never managed to prove for 20 or 30 years. Now, why do you have to do all that?" people didn't realize what it really. I felt we were getting to a crossroad. I didn't want Israel to become a place, where international or serious criminals have their home place.
The Minister of Interior said that if Lansky loses his Supreme Court case for citizenship, that Israel would allow him to go to any country he was welcome. There was a big split within the Israeli government on whether he should get citizenship, so this appears to be the compromise. Deny citizenship, but allow him to go wherever he's welcome. On September 11, 1972, Israel's highest court ruled that Lansky was not entitled to citizenship even though he is a Jew. A 5-member Supreme Court panel unanimously upheld a government order to expel Lansky, who was present in the court and appeared disquieted by the ruling.
People in Washington told me, people of the Ministry of Justice, they told me that there were lots of people waiting, all kinds of people. They said if he could come, anyone could come to Israel. And that was really a question of principle. So the fact that we managed to prevent this man from becoming an Israeli citizen, I think this was one of the most important cases that we had in Israel.
In September 1972, Israel's Supreme Court ruled against Lansky.
Well, so long.
He was ordered to leave the country.
On November 5th, Lansky left Tel Aviv at 7:45 p.m. for Switzerland, where he had been sending money to Swiss banks for decades, but the FBI with local officials denied him access to Switzerland when he landed. Then Lansky took off at midnight for Brazil. Every time he landed, he was met with FBI agents and local officials. He left Rio on a Pan American flight for Argentina, then on a Braniff Airlines to Paraguay, and then Bolivia, Peru, and Panama. After 37 hours of flying 13,000 miles over 2 days, the fugitive returned to Miami on November 7th. As he landed in Miami, Lansky was dozing in a first-class seat. Moments later, an FBI agent touched his shoulder and informed him he was under arrest. Lansky's attorney posted bond and then drove him to Mount Sinai Hospital for cardiac insufficiency.
The long odyssey of Meyer Lansky is over. A flight that took the reputed financial wizard of the underworld from Israel to the one place he didn't want to go. Bruce Hall reports from Miami.
The 71-year-old Lansky was taken into custody early this morning in Miami after being denied asylum in 6 countries. He hopscotched around the world for 2 days after being kicked out of Israel. During the trip, he reportedly offered $1 million to any country that would take him. But he found no takers when the plane made stops in Switzerland, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, and Panama. He fled the United States 2 years ago to avoid charges of income tax evasion and interstate racketeering. Lansky was held on $650,000 bond, but only 9 hours after arriving, he posted bond and was released. He was ordered to remain in the Miami area. Lansky's attorney said he was not going anywhere. He described Lansky as a sick man with no place to go. Bruce Hall, CBS News, Miami.
3 days later, his wife Teddy arrived from Israel, and she was not used to all the press attention. She said, "My son rushed to the plane to tell me there were reporters and photography by the score. I felt defeated after a long trip. A reporter from television attacked me verbally, called me godmother. I spat in her face."
Now look, go away from me, I'll kill you.
When the reporters wouldn't leave her alone, Teddy used a tactic her husband had never tried. She spat on them.
Lansky stayed at the hospital for about 10 days due to his heart condition, but the FBI said that it is suspected the real purpose of Lansky's hospitalization is for a postponement of future court proceedings. The criminal contempt trial in Miami was delayed until February 26, 1973, which may also delay the Flamingo skimming trial in Las Vegas.
He looked like somebody's grandfather, anybody's grandfather. He looked very, very harmless, and he certainly didn't look like an organized crime character.
Are you pleased with the way your attorneys handled your defense?
I'm sorry, but no comment.
Well, you can't blame me for asking, can you?
No, I don't blame you at all. I'm with you.
On February 28th, Lansky was found guilty of criminal contempt and was free on bond while he awaits the sentence and appeals the verdict. On March 16th, he had open-heart surgery, and the judge in the Flamingo skimming case said that the trial for Lansky was postponed indefinitely due to his health status. On April 27th, 4 co-defendants pled guilty in the Flamingo skimming case, with Samuel Cohen and Morris Landsberg sentenced to 1 year, but they would serve about 4 months. Trials were still pending for 3 others, including Lansky. On June 14th, Meyer was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison for criminal contempt for ignoring the subpoena, but he was still free on bond pending the appeal. His Flamingo skimming case was delayed until January 1974, and then again until May 7th, because the 72-year-old man was ill and had suffered several heart attacks and minor strokes. And then the skimming case was delayed again until September 3rd. His criminal contempt guilty verdict was overturned in June. The judge said, when the government requested that the court fix March 11th as the return date of the subpoena, it made compliance by the defendant virtually impossible. Lansky's attorney said that when the subpoena was served, that his doctor in Israel told him that he wasn't healthy enough to travel back to America due to his heart condition. But the U.S. attorney said that he evaded early service of the subpoena, and the March 11th return date was only set after his attorney's refusal to agree on any date. It was a very expensive trial for the government, both in time and money. All I can say is that we did our job, and a jury convicted him. On August 21st, Judge Foley in the Flamingo skimming case said that the case will lie dormant on the court calendar until Lansky dies or government counsel dismisses the indictment. Medical evidence in the record of the case shows that it is almost a certainty that Lansky will never be well enough to undergo the rigors of a trial. In December, the government decided not to appeal the reversal on the criminal contempt guilty verdict, so Meyer Lansky was now a free man with no sentences to serve and no pending trials. Rumors circulated that the cardiologist who performed the heart surgery on Lansky had merely made an incision and then sewed him back up. The surgeons, to relieve any suspicions, saved some of Lansky's heart tissue to be preserved as proof. The FBI continued to follow the activities of Lansky in 1975, 1976, and 1977. Almost a decade after his Flamingo case was dismissed due to a heart condition, Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer on January 15, 1983, in Miami. An FBI agent once said he would have been chairman of the board of General Motors if he'd gone into legitimate business. A former Miami FBI supervisor said, "He was respectful of us, and we were more or less respectful of him. We tried to respect his privacy. Of all the hoodlums, he was the only one who added a touch of personal class."
Meyer Lansky's life reflected the entire history of organized crime in America. Because he was a Jew, he could never become a member of that inner circle of the mob, the Italian Mafia. Yet he was more powerful than any of them, and he had more influence in shaping the mob's destiny than any other single individual. The mob tapped him as its consultant. It was Lansky's job to develop casino gambling. The mob provided the muscle and the original money. Lansky provided the brains. He was a survivor who outlived his contemporaries because he was smarter and more cunning, because he understood human nature and knew how to exploit it. In his circles, he was known as a man of his word. A deal was a deal, and he never talked. With him, the mob felt its secrets and its investments were safe. I'm Clarence Jones, Channel 10 Eyewitness News.
Meyer Lansky spent the last 10 years of his life in Miami Beach after the state of Israel, labeling him a danger to public safety, kicked him out in 1972. Much of Lansky's time in Miami was spent before grand juries as federal investigators attempted to put him behind bars for casino skimming, contempt of court, and other crimes. The man who was known as the financial wizard of the underworld had little to say in his later years. Reporters always gathered around trying to pick his brain, but Lansky, always the gentleman, talked only about his failing health.
How's your heart? Have you been doing anything active, or you been taking it pretty easy?
Oh, I have to take it easy. You're looking mighty pretty today.
Thank you.
Lansky was credited by federal investigators with masterminding the complicated process of laundering money from illegal gambling operations. Persistent rumors put the figures at $100 to $400 million. But Lansky lived a modest life in Miami Beach, keeping a checking account of only $2,500. In a rare interview in 1977, he claimed the specter of organized crime was a myth and steadfastly refused until his death to talk about his many years as an underworld financier.
I can say a lot, but I'm going to reserve that for posterity.
David Goldstein, Channel 4 News.
He was buried the next day in Miami, and the FBI was still following. Hidden behind the tombstones were FBI agents, taking photographs of all the mourners' license plates.
When he passed away in 1983, were there a lot of mobsters
at the
types
funeral?
at the
No.
funeral?
No.
It wasn't a traditional
No,
gangster
we
funeral.
were outnumbered by the FBI and the press. And my husband tried to arrange two funerals, the real one and the phony. It didn't work.
Most believed that he had at least a few $1,000,000 to his name, but on paper, after his death, he had about $100,000 to the surprise of his family. Teddy's daughter-in-law, Susan Schwartz, said, "While he confided in me while they were living in Israel that he still had a couple million socked away in Switzerland, the legal fees really drained him. Very little of his businesses were running towards the end, and nothing was ever written down." Lansky's daughter said, "My dad was the best. As a child, he took me to floor shows, ice skating, the theater, movies, and for long walks. I was a spoiled brat." His grandson said, "Innocent people may have been killed now and then, but not like the crimes of today. That is why my grandfather's era of crime is so popular. They were like gentlemen killers, and they dressed nice, had good times at parties, dances, casinos." Anthony Summers came out with a book in 1993 with evidence that showed J. Edgar Hoover protected organized crime for years because top mobsters had evidence of his homosexual activities and dressing in drag. Multiple prominent mobsters, including Meyer Lansky, had photographic evidence of Hoover's physical relationship with his longtime FBI assistant, Clyde Tolson, and Hoover participating in orgies at the Plaza Hotel in New York. Young boys joined the party and engaged in sexual activities with Hoover. By 1936, the mob was well aware of Hoover's sexuality and secret life. To New York City mob boss Frank Costello and to his associate Meyer Lansky, the ability to corrupt politicians, policemen, and judges was fundamental to mafia operations. It was Lansky's expertise in such corruption that made him the nearest thing there ever was to a true national godfather of organized crime. It was a strict underworld rule never to use violent means against a law enforcement officer. They spoke of Meyer Lansky as a genius, the man who put everything together, and as the man who nailed J. Edgar Hoover. Lansky was the guy who controlled the pictures, and he had made his deal with Hoover to lay off. One time, an FBI agent started to develop good leads on Lansky's criminal activities, but then the agent was transferred out of state and replaced with a seasoned agent who knew the situation between Hoover and Lansky. There was no serious federal effort to indict Lansky until 1970, just 2 years before Edgar died. Then, it was the IRS rather than the FBI that spearheaded the investigation into the $36 million tax evasion in the Flamingo skimming case. Meyer Lansky kept a book of quotes and random thoughts in his desk drawer.